Thank you. Such an honor to be here tonight. Thank you, Bruce, for the kind introduction. So we always joke that Bruce is the right hemisphere of the Mac and I'm the left hemisphere. But tonight we're going to actually take a whole brain approach. And the idea, even in studying and caring for individuals with dyslexia, is that we don't just want to look at reading and linguistic abilities, but we want to look at strengths as well. And so we want to look at other networks of the brain that are involved in music and emotions and in other functions. So we're going to talk a lot about reading tonight, and what is so special about reading. So reading is a skill that is really unique to humans. It requires us to associate sounds and words with written symbols and with meaning. It needs to be taught. This is an interesting aspect that we'll go back to. If many of us, most of us, only 3% of people will learn to read and write if they're not explicitly taught. It's evolutionary, a new skill, only the last 6,000 years, not as much as the instruments that we heard about. And this is important from a brain point of view because 6,000 years is really not enough for the brain to develop a network specific for reading. So we need to take our networks that we have for vision and for language and readapt them to learn to read and write. It's heavily influenced by culture and writing system. So in some languages, the link between the meaning and the sounds of words and the written aspects is completely arbitrary, like in Chinese. In my favorite language, of course, Italian, there is a code that you can learn. Every letter corresponds to a sound. And so someone can learn to read Italian without really understanding the meaning of the words. In English, we have a middle way. Some words are regular, but most of them are actually exception words that need to be learned. It's believed that despite these differences in the different codes in the different languages, there is a universal neurobiological substrate for language in the left hemisphere. So what is developmental dyslexia? So there's many different definitions. The one that I like most is just a kind of a functional definition. So it's a difficulty with reading and spelling, so what we call decoding these symbols, despite normal intelligence and education exposure. So the fact that someone has trouble decoding something, a code that they don't know, has nothing to do with their general intelligence. It is of neurobiological origin. This was a huge advance in the last 20 years to say that dyslexia is not an academic problem, it's not a school problem, although many of the solutions for it are in the school. It's really a neurobiological origin. It's highly familial, so it has a genetic component to it. It's quite frequent, so 10% of the population. Despite that, it's still very under-identified and understudied. And in this case, when it's not recognized and addressed, because it can be recognized and addressed, then it can lead to a lot of bad consequences, such as loss of self-esteem, anxiety, depression, school dropout and poverty, and therefore risk for criminal behavior. So it is an issue that we would consider mild, a difference in the brain, but if we need to address it, otherwise it can have really drastic consequences. So as Bruce was saying, language is in the left hemisphere. Really, in 95% of right-handers, language is lateralized to the left. We think it has evolved to the left because the representation of the right hand is in the left hemisphere of the brain, and thus when we learn to manipulate objects, we started wanting to give them names, and therefore the names of objects got organized in this near where the hand is organized. But it's more complicated than that. There are many different networks in the brain that do lift different parts of language and symbolic knowledge, and same for the right hemisphere. The one that interests us more tonight is probably that reading music, just like doing simple math arithmetics, is more of a left hemisphere aspect function, while high-level mathematics like calculus or geometry and the sense of musicality is probably more a right hemisphere function. Why are we interested in these different networks? Modern neuroscience is starting to tell us that the different networks in the brain actually function in balance with each other. So as you can see in this video, when the red networks are functioning, the blue ones need to shut down. And this balance between them is probably the basis of the strengths and weaknesses that we see of individuals with dyslexia. So reading requires coordination of visual, auditory, and language processing. If this is a network in a typically developing individual, this is an example of one of the dyslexic kids that we saw in our center. There is a small differences, probably an increased actually volume of the gray matter in this area. And this can have consequences in the connectivity and the function of this network. But on the right hemisphere, this could result in increased connectivity and a different function that can be actually the basis of these strengths in this individual. We really see in dyslexia different patterns of anatomy and activation in different parts of this circuit. So we really think that there is more than one type of dyslexia, and I can't go into detail tonight, but we think there is at least 6 parts, 6 different of what we call phenotypes. And what we want to go is to a place in which these weaknesses in these different networks in the brain can actually be more predicted by the associated strengths instead of the specific difficulties. This is an example of a neurosignature of different strengths and weaknesses in dyslexia. You can see that this individual, the difference in this blue pathway in the brain that we can measure using MRI scanners. In this individual is more in this green pathway, and actually you can see that in these 2 individuals is completely opposite. In one there is thickening of this network on the right and thinning on the left, thickening on the left and thinning on the right, and in this one is opposite. And the consequences and what this means in a school is that probably children will need different interventions, and that one intervention for dyslexia doesn't fit all individuals. So what are the strengths that actually we have observed in kids who have gone through our study with dyslexia? We have specific tasks that really try to isolate functions that are not they are not confounded by linguistic functions. So this is a task in which children and adults need to navigate around a virtual environment, and they have 15 turns they need to learn. And actually what we saw is that there was a higher percentage of dyslexic compared to controls that were, as we say, spatial superstars. So they needed only 6 trials to learn this 15 turns route. This was not related to IQ in dyslexia, so to general intelligence, and this makes us think that this is probably a function that is different in this individual. It's not that they're just smarter and so they have increased spatial functioning, they just do this task in a different way that is more efficient. And this is not surprising, thinking of how many architects and visual artists there are in who are dyslexic. The neurosignature of this function is this thickening or increased volume of this pathway on the right hemisphere compared to the left. So the skills in this spatial task are correlated to how efficient, how developed this specific pathway in the brain is. Another function that I think is really interesting, and I think is going to be very related to the musical talents in dyslexic individual, is this ability to recognize pattern and organize information in a meaningful way. So for many dyslexic kids, learning verbal information by rote is very difficult. Any parents of a dyslexic child knows what a nightmare the timetables are. So learning the timetables it's really, really difficult because they're really learning them as by rote memory. What is much easier and actually more efficient in children with dyslexia is learning words in categories. So when we ask them to say as many words as they can think of that start with the letter F is very difficult. But if we ask them to say as many words as you can think of that are animals, they actually produce more. And this is a base of some of the talents for pattern recognition, we think, quick understanding and storytelling. So we think that putting together these abilities in pattern recognition with the increased emotional understanding, as Virginia will illustrate, and musicality, as Indra will illustrate, will probably create what we think outstanding performers. So increased emotional reactivity, understanding patterns into music. Maybe this is a combination that can create outstanding performance. And musical talent might be masked in children with dyslexia by early music decoding difficulties. So this is a message for parents in the audience and for maybe a collaboration in the future with the San Francisco Conservatory to really figure out the best strategies to teach music to dyslexic kids. And I'm going to end with this quote by Albert Einstein that says, "Everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it's stupid." And I'm just going to thank all of our collaborating schools, and without whom this work wouldn't be possible, and all of our supporters and donors who have been incredibly generous with us, and everybody at the Memory and Aging Center, the Dyslexia Center, and at GBHI. Thank you.